Our guest on This Is America and the World is Joby Warrick. He's national security reporter for The Washington Post, author of The Triple Agent, the al-Qaeda mole who infiltrated the CIA, and author of the new book, Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS, which has just been awarded a 2016 Pulitzer Prize. Joby, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
When you look at Syria, Iraq, ISIL today, how do you put it all together for yourself as a reporter?
It's been called the problem from hell, and I think that remains the case today. We've been working on this issue for 5 years now. It seems to only be getting worse instead of better, and it's not just a horrible situation for people in the region, but it's managed to spawn this new thing that we're dealing with, ISIS, which existed in sort of a latent form in Iraq before the Syrian conflict, but managed to arise out of that vacuum and just give us this really horrible, brutal organization that we're wrestling with today.
So when we read in the newspaper about ISIS or ISIL, as the president likes to call it, I'm not quite sure why he's hung up on that, but we see it on the newscast or hear about it radio. What do we know about them as far as the number of followers they may have, their goals?
Well, they're an interesting organization in that they've managed to recruit very heavily and successfully from around the world, unlike any organization we've seen really since al-Qaeda, and now they've outdone al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. They're said to have close to 40,000 followers in total. That's just in Iraq and Syria. There's more in other parts of the world. They have seen every week there's a new organization that comes up someplace else. Mm-hmm. But they all have this central goal, which is reestablishing the caliphate. That's this idea of giving a new birth to this Islamic kingdom that existed in the past, but they want to bring to life today. And they also have this apocalyptic vision that by bringing this caliphate to life, they're going to bring about literally the end of the world.
Is it more focused on their goals in the Middle East and the caliphate, or does it have anything to do with hating the West and trying to attack America, although they certainly have attacked Europe?
Yeah, it's mostly about the Middle East because they want to restore the rightful order of the Middle East. But we're bad guys to them. We're the ones that created the situation in the Middle East that they're struggling with. Back 100 years ago, and right at the end of World War I, the victorious Allies carved up the Middle East, carved up the old Ottoman Empire into countries that hadn't existed before. Mm-hmm. So suddenly there's an Israel, there's a Jordan, there's new boundaries that didn't exist. So they want to drive us out of the region so they can remake the map, literally, in their image, and do with it what they want to do. Mm-hmm. So that's objective one, and if we're essentially collateral damage along the way. They want to kill us, to scare us, in order to drive us out.
So they have pieces now of Iraq and pieces now of Syria. Mm-hmm. Is it a huge landmass, or do we read occasionally in the papers that it's getting smaller because of our efforts there?
Yeah, it is shrinking. At one point, it's about the size of Great Britain, which is pretty incredible to think about. It's been shrinking over the last year and a half. It's about 40% smaller than it was at its height, which is not to say it's defeated, because it still has the second largest city in Iraq, which is Mosul. It's got Raqqa, which is its capital in Syria. These are big cities with big metropolitan areas, which also give it a lot of resources, not just fighters, but oil wells, banks, universities, laboratories. So in that sense, it's a better equipped terrorist organization than we've ever seen in the history of the planet.
When they say Islamic terrorist, is that a fair characterization? Because Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia comes out and says, they're not following Islam. Many imams around the Middle East have come out against it. Not terribly well reported here on our side of the ocean. And then organizations that are devoted to Islam have all said, basically, they're not followers of Islam. They're satanic.
Yeah, exactly. This is where people wrestle with terminology because there's no really good word for them. They certainly claim themselves to be Islamists, and their sort of goals are Islamic related, and they claim a very pious, very harsh interpretation of Islam. But as you say, a lot of things they do are not really in keeping with Islam as mainstream scholars understand it. Some things they do would actually be considered, atrocities against the religion, like burning of human beings, which they've done in the past, or killing of innocents, killing of Muslim men and women without any justification. The thing is about ISIS, and going even back to their predecessor organizations, they don't really care about those rules because they bend them and break them as they see fit and then justify it afterward. They bring in imams who they pay to say, yeah, it's okay to have suicide bombers. It's okay to burn a pilot because this part of the ancient text says you can do it. So they're very nimble in that way, but you could certainly make the case they're not Islamic in a traditional way.
The brutality just has amazed people and disgusted people. And it must be so painful to the followers of Islam, you know, good practicing Muslims, to see this kind of brutality. What do you know? What do you make of that piece of the file?
I could tell you it's hard for a writer as well, because getting immersed in this and actually watching those videos and kind of forcing myself to watch them week after week after week as part of my research, and you're numb after a while, and yet you never really get used to it because they always find some new wrinkle, some new way to inflict pain. And so it's hard to see them as human beings. And the interesting thing is that even other Islamists, even bin Laden and his organization, saw these guys as just being disgusting, as being vile, and warned them again and again, you have to stop doing these things. These beheadings are terrible for our reputation and our image. Just knock it off. And yet they continue to do it because they know that it works in a weird way. It is effective because it does frighten people. It certainly got the whole world's attention when they started cutting off people's heads in 2014. And it also excites their own base. The people that are most inclined to help them and to fight for them like this stuff. They see it as being powerful, as being provocative, as kind of getting in the face of the West. And so in that sense, they enjoy it.
You mentioned just a minute or so ago the videos you were watching for research. What have you seen that we have not seen?
You know, I think, a lot of us have seen the beheadings or bits of them. We've seen this horrible video that came out in 2015 when a young pilot was put in a cage and doused with gasoline and set afire. The ones that are most disturbing to me and aren't as commonly seen involve children. And this is often children being asked to do awful, awful things. Children being asked to come in and shoot a man in the head, for example. And then, the camera pans in on the kid's face and watches the man die. And so when you see children brought into those awful practices, it really is chilling.
Wow. We are talking with Joby Warrick, and his book, which I've read over the weekend, he is a Pulitzer Prize winner. This book has just won the Pulitzer Prize. The title of the book is Black Flags. What a provocative cover. We'll talk about that a little bit on the other side, but it is such a pleasure to have someone who can educate us on what I could also say is such a brutal and horrible organization. Black Flags, and the subtitle of the book, The Rise of ISIS. So take a little break. Back on the other side, This is America and the World. This is America and the World is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Ambassador Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. Tourism Malaysia. The Petroleum Group, expertise with integrity in the fields of oil and gas, exploration and production, energy, and infrastructure. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And VENTANA Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services. Joby, let me put the book on the screen again and tell us a little bit about what we're taking a look at, because it's a very provocative cover.
Yeah. So the man sort of ghosted image that you see on the cover is a man named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And folks who have seen, for example, American Sniper may remember that name. This is the insurgent in Iraq that gave the U.S. occupational forces, hell for 4 years while they were trying to track him down. And also a lot of our people were trying to, just to literally take him out. There was a bounty on his head. But he was the one that really innovated all the ideas, or nearly all the ideas, that ISIS is all about today. Everything from beheading young men in jumpsuits to just the suicide bombings, the emphasis on building a caliphate. It all sprung out of the mind of this man. He's the godfather of the organization.
Let's turn the clock back and go back to the beginning and take us to this notorious prison in Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a couple of people in a small band of prisoners that they're holding that stand out. One is a scholar, a preacher,
mm-hmm.
and the other likes to be called is it the stranger?
The stranger, yeah.
The stranger. Tell us a little bit about who's there and what this prison is all about, what the conditions are, and who al-Zarqawi is.
Yeah. So in the mid-90s, this is after the Afghan civil war is over, Jordan and a lot of the Middle East countries have this problem with all these young men who'd gone off to fight the communists, gone off to fight in Afghanistan, coming back home and radicalized. They're completely changed by sort of immersion in violence, but also changed by being inundated with this new kind of doctrine. This was the beginning of really the modern jihadist movement. Mm-hmm. And so in that group was this young man, or Zarqawi as he came to be known, a scholar named Makdisi, who's also part of this prison. But these are radical men, and they tended to draw other prisoners to them. And so the Jordanians had this idea of trying to isolate them. So they moved them away from the main prison, put them in a prison by themselves in order to kind of contain the contagion. And in this fertile environment, these guys, there are about 50 of them, all became just super close. They developed essentially infrastructure, organizational structures that Zarqawi and Makdisi were the head, and the others were fierce and devoted followers. So in that prison is where you see the kernel of what later became Al-Qaeda in Iraq, mm-hmm. and today ISIS. But it all really started more than 15 years ago.
So Zarqawi comes from a kind of an industrial background, one of 10 children, as I recall. Interestingly enough, as you say, very close to his mother. But he's a street thug. He's a drunkard. Tell us a little bit more about his background, the tattoo business.
Yeah, it's amazing. He's been underestimated, or was underestimated throughout his life, even by his own family. And there's these interesting anecdotes when he does become famous, and journalists go back to talk to the mother and ask about this famous terrorist. And she used to laugh it off and say, well, he's not that smart. And nobody really thought he was very smart because he dropped out of school, he didn't do well, he was a juvenile delinquent, ended up getting in knife fights, and then got tattoos and everything that you wouldn't expect a young religious man to do. And yet he ended up getting very religious in his early 20s. And that's when he got this idea, go off and fight the war, go off and become a mujahideen. And that really was the transformative moment for him. The sad part is that many thousands of young men have made that same journey recently, going to Syria, going to Iraq to fight with ISIS, and then coming back with all kinds of radical ideas about wanting to change the West.
So there he is in prison, and he is released. There's kind of a blanket release. How did that all happen?
Yeah, he had a couple of really interesting, very fortunate things that happened to him. One was in 1999. He was supposed to be in prison for 15 years. Would have been in his middle age in 2009 when he should have been released. But in 1999, the king of Jordan dies. The king at the time was Hussein. And there was a tradition in Jordan where after a king's death, there's a general amnesty, particularly for political prisoners. It's often broader than that. And in this case, more than 2,000 people were put on a list to be freed. On that list was our guy Zarqawi and most of his group. Almost all of them ended up being released. And that was a historical, history-changing moment with these young men with their radical ideas marching out of a prison and then off to Afghanistan to do things.
We don't want to let our time together slip by without calling attention to two things. One is the present king of Jordan, who in many ways predicts exactly the chaos and the horror that is going to happen, and also the Secret Service or the intelligence community of Jordan. Very, very sharp people, huh?
Absolutely. And
Talk a little bit about both of them and where they fit into the story.
yeah, the king is this remarkable character because he wasn't supposed to be king. His
I
father
like
had
you calling him a character.
sort
I
of,
like that.
it
He
is
a
true. It's kind of
He
it's a-
rides motorcycles. And,
Yes, it is true. And there's this saying in Jordan that if you're a Middle East leader, there's no expectation of living to an old age. And that's typically been the case because not only it's a dangerous part of the world, but both Abdullah, the present king, and his father were kind of daredevils. They rode motorcycles, they jumped out of planes.
Yeah.
They had kind of a very active lifestyle, to say the least. But he ends up inheriting this very small but troubled kingdom with economic problems, with living in a bad neighborhood. But he is the one, almost like Cassandra, warning from the beginning about the problems of what happens if we invade Iraq. And sure, we can overthrow Saddam Hussein, but what happens next? Really concerned about the region and what would happen after the war. And also, after Arab Spring, he began to move, very smartly in his own country to grant freedoms, to push for reforms, to give people more liberties, but in a measured way, not trying to kind of overthrow old institutions and establishments. But he was also warning the neighbors. He warned the Syrian president, you have to reform, you can't just ignore the people's wishes. But he was pushed aside again and again, and his worst prophecies came true.
and Assad keeps hanging up on him, right?
Yeah,
In
exactly.
Syria,
Yeah.
right? No matter what he says. And the intelligence community, in the end, come together with the U.S.
Yeah.
intelligence folks and start to track him. But I want to go sideways for a second because there is the American invasion. And how does that play into the story?
Yeah, this is probably the one thing. I argue that ISIS would not exist without Zarqawi, and Zarqawi would not have existed without the Iraq invasion.
Wow.
We did two things. One
Say
is
it again?
Iraq would not have, sorry to say that again, ISIS would not have existed without Zarqawi, the godfather, and Zarqawi would not have existed without the Iraq invasion. It's pretty clear to me from just everything we can judge from that period of history. But the one thing happened was Zarqawi was a nobody. He was off living in a corner of, off in the mountains, didn't really have any resources.
How does he end up in that little patch of land
Yeah.
up there in Iraq? How does he get there, and what's he thinking up there now?
A really interesting sequence of events because he wanted to be part of Osama bin Laden's movement. But Osama bin Laden didn't want him. He said,
He
this
didn't
guy's
want
too
him.
dangerous. He's too crazy. Let's push him way off to the end of Iraq or Afghanistan and not worry about him. So he was there for a while. Then the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan takes place, or the U.S. conflict. And he ends up moving further west across the mountains into Iraq, but in this no man's land, Kurdish territory that where it's covered by the no-fly zone. Saddam's forces are not allowed there.
Kurdish territory.
Kurdish territory. So he ends up in this little enclave with a few dozen of these very fanatical men, and they're plotting their next big move, but they're kind of trapped. They're in a corner. But then in 2003, right before the invasion, Colin Powell, the Secretary of State at the time, goes to the UN to make the case for invasion of Iraq. And one of the bits of evidence that he puts on the big screen is this image, literally this picture of Zarqawi saying this is a connection between al-Qaeda, which we fear, and Saddam Hussein, the dictator. These guys are colluding. They could share weapons. They could share weapons of mass destruction. So we need to go into Iraq to eliminate this threat. And it turns out that by making that speech, there wasn't any basis to it. There was no connection between this man and Saddam Hussein. But literally overnight, he became very famous. Jihadists wanted to join up with them. People started sending him money. And then when U.S. troops moved into the country, he was in Baghdad. Not Osama bin Laden. Zarqawi moved to Baghdad to await the arrival of U.S. troops and to declare war on them as soon as they arrived.
So there's a couple of things. As far as weapons of mass destruction, as Hayden says, former CIA director, former head of the NSA, we got it wrong.
Yeah.
They weren't there. And this connection that people were trying to make of establishing connections between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. And even as you put on the table, Osama bin Laden was not too thrilled with Zarqawi. In the end, they formed some kind of a connection. Let me put on the screen for the folks at home in this, I'm going to say brilliant book, a map, which will, and feel free to point out different places that we should know, but as we're telling the story now, where Zarqawi was hanging out before he moved to Baghdad and how he gets so involved in the middle of our occupation, invasion
Yeah.
of Iraq.
So here he is in this kind of mountainous no man's land. You've got Iran on one side. This is Kurdish territory, and he's right up against the border. So he's in a place where if he does get in trouble, he can run across the mountains and try to escape Saddam's forces. But he really was in a no man's land. Then when, of course, the U.S. invasion takes place and Baghdad falls, the entire apparatus of the Iraqi state falls, he quickly finds his way into Baghdad, into the heartland of what is we know as Anbar Province, Ramadi, Fallujah, these towns that would become famous later. And that's where he found his sympathetic followers, the Sunnis that were out of jobs because the U.S. had disbanded the Iraqi army, they disbanded the Ba'athist Party, so they were looking for a way to fight back against the Americans. We found plenty of allies there.
A couple of places that you mentioned earlier in our conversation, Raqqa and Mosul. Point those out to the folks on the map here.
Okay.
And because they are critically important today, right?
Absolutely. So here's Syria, this large area here. A lot of the fighting that we see, on TV every day takes place in places like Aleppo in the north. There's some fighting in the south. But this is the town of Raqqa. It's right here on the Euphrates River, and it's a place that ISIS found most amenable to them. It wasn't heavily defended by regime forces, and so they're able to take it over. And it is today their capital. This is where they conduct their operations. And then in 2014, as most of us remember, the ISIS force just rolled across the western border of Iraq, ended up taking over about a third of the country, including Mosul, which is the second largest Iraqi city, with more than 1 million people in the environments of Mosul, and entire banks with vaults full of currency. Everything a terrorist could want suddenly became theirs almost overnight.
So nowadays, we established about 40,000 followers in that area. I guess part of the story is that al-Qaeda in Iraq morphs into ISIS, right? The Islamic State. Tell us where we are today.
Okay. So that happened really, that change took place after al-Zarqawi was killed.
He was killed in 2006,
2006,
as I recall, right?
because we were very determined to get him. We finally got an intelligence break. We were able to find a safe house, and a U.S. jet fighter dropped a couple of bombs on the house and it killed him. So we recovered his body. It was confirmed that he was dead, and assumed that his organization would fall apart. It didn't happen that quickly, but eventually we got his number. We got their number. We started killing number 2s and number 3s, driving al-Qaeda in Iraq underground. And by the time we left Iraq in 2010, 2011, they were pretty much finished, but not entirely. There was still kind of a very small infrastructure that existed with people like al-Baghdadi, who's the leader of ISIS now. But the thing that allowed them to come back, there are actually two things. One was Arab Spring. Suddenly you have conflicts in places like Syria that create, anywhere there's turmoil and chaos is an opportunity for guys like this to move in. And also the Iraqi government was just falling apart, and Sunnis were fighting Shia. There was big divides among the sectarian groups. And that was also an opportunity for ISIS to say to the Sunnis, we're on your side, you should help us, we should help each other. And essentially that's what happened in 2014 when ISIS was able to race across Iraq with Sunni help. A lot of Sunni tribes backed them and allowed them to take over cities.
So now in Iraq today, is there a Sunni-Shia head crunch going on? That's putting it mildly, I guess.
It's still the problem.
With ISIS in the middle there someplace?
Yeah. The fortunate thing is that ISIS tends to wear out its welcome pretty quickly. So even these cities where people initially supported ISIS, they fairly quickly changed their mind. Nobody wants to live under this terrible dictatorship that ISIS brings. But there is continuing the problem that some people in Iraq would almost prefer ISIS than living under the regime that's led by the Shiites. And there's all kinds of blame to go around there, but that's a problem that hasn't been solved. It's still very central to Iraqi politics today, and it's hard to imagine now how those pieces will ever be put back together as they were.
So now the focus is on Aleppo, and it's in Syria, and so we got the vice president going to Iraq, and then all of a sudden bands of people at the provocation of one of the imams running into the green zone, and I mean, it is chaos there yet again, huh?
And it complicates things for us because our hope now is that we can defeat ISIS by bringing some order to the Iraqi government, by helping them govern themselves.
That's not going to happen, is
And
it?
now it's completely exploded all over again. It's not even clear, what the leadership of Iraq is going to be in 6 months or a year from now.
ISIS getting stronger or getting weaker?
Well, they're getting weaker, I think, in Iraq and Syria, but they're putting more resources now in other places. So you see a pretty robust organization in Libya in particular, and Yemen,
Yeah.
even in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So it's like whack-a-mole. You hit them here, and suddenly they're someplace else. So it's a generational struggle.
Joby Warrick's book, Black Flags. I've read it cover to cover. A Pulitzer Prize-winning book. And a journalist of just such dedication. And it reads just beautifully. This man knows how to write and craft a sentence like very, very few people. It is an honor and pleasure to have you here. Joby, so good to meet you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
All right, good luck
Terrific,
to you.
terrific conversation. Thanks so much. This is just a terrific book.
Thank you.
You must be very proud.
Thank you.
And I like the sticker down
Me too.
here. Very nice.
For information about This Is America and the World, and to watch all of our programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net, and look for us on Facebook and Twitter. This Is America and the World is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Ambassador Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. Tourism Malaysia. The Petrolin Group, expertise with integrity in the fields of oil and gas, exploration and production, energy, and infrastructure. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And VENTANA Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services.